November 1943. Bougainville Island, Solomon Islands. A Japanese infantry company, nearly 200 men strong, charges down a jungle ridge toward American Marine positions. They've done this before. They know the Americans have artillery support somewhere in the rear. But artillery takes time. Time to spot the enemy. Time to send a runner back to headquarters. Time for headquarters to relay coordinates to the gun batteries. Time for the guns to adjust their aim. The Japanese officers calculated they had at least 15 to 20 minutes before American artillery could respond. Maybe longer in this dense jungle terrain. Plenty of time to overrun the Marine positions in brutal close combat, where Japanese troops excelled. They were wrong. 60 seconds after the attack began, American 105mm howitzer shells began exploding directly on top of the charging Japanese formation. Not 15 minutes. Not 5 minutes. 60 seconds. The Japanese company was shattered before it reached the Marine lines. Survivors who retreated reported something impossible. The Americans had somehow called down fire from the sky almost instantly, as if the artillery observers were standing right next to the frontline troops. What the Japanese soldiers didn't know was that the Marines carried something revolutionary on their backs. The SCR-300 radio. A portable, backpack-mounted communication system that would fundamentally change how warfare was conducted. This is the story of how a 35-pound radio gave American forces a communications advantage so overwhelming that Japanese commanders couldn't understand how they were losing battles they should have won. To understand why the SCR-300 was revolutionary, we need to understand the communication nightmare that plagued every army in World War II. In 1941, when America entered World War II, battlefield communication hadn't fundamentally changed since World War I. If you were an infantry officer at the front line and needed artillery support, here's what you had to do. First, you had to physically see the enemy position and estimate its location using a map and compass. In dense jungle, thick forest, or hilly terrain, this was already difficult. Second, you had to get that information back to your battalion headquarters. This meant either sending a runner on foot, which could take 10 to 30 minutes depending on distance and terrain, using a field telephone, which required stringing hundreds of yards of wire through enemy territory, using visual signals like flags or flares, which only worked in daylight and good weather. Third, battalion headquarters had to relay that information to the artillery fire direction center, usually by telephone or radio. Fourth, the fire direction center had to calculate firing solutions and relay them to the gun batteries. Fifth, the batteries had to adjust their aim and fire. Sixth, you had to observe where the shells landed and send corrections back through this entire chain again. From the moment you spotted enemy troops to the moment shells started landing could easily take 15 to 30 minutes. Often longer. The Japanese communication system. The Imperial Japanese Army in the Pacific faced even worse communication problems than most armies. Japanese military doctrine emphasized aggressive infantry assault and close combat. Their philosophy was that brave soldiers with high morale could overcome material disadvantages. Communication equipment was considered less important than rifles and ammunition. As a result, Japanese infantry units were chronically under-equipped with radios. A typical Japanese infantry regiment might have only a handful of radio sets, usually kept at regimental or battalion headquarters. Company and platoon commanders had no radios at all. Instead, Japanese officers relied on telephone lines. Japanese units would string field telephone wire as they advanced. But these lines were fragile, easily cut by artillery, bombing, or even soldiers accidentally tripping over them in the jungle. Runners. Human messengers carrying written orders or verbal messages. This was the primary communication method for Japanese infantry. It was slow, unreliable, and runners were frequently killed or captured. Bugle calls and flags. For immediate tactical signals during battle. These only worked over short distances and required troops to hear or see them amid the chaos of combat. Prearranged signals. Colored flares or smoke signals for specific predetermined messages. Limited vocabulary of signals. This system had worked adequately in China, where Japanese forces often fought less well-equipped Chinese armies. But against American forces with superior communication, it would prove catastrophic. Japanese artillery support was particularly handicapped. A Japanese infantry commander under attack might need 20 to 45 minutes to request artillery support if the telephone lines hadn't been cut. By that time, the tactical situation had usually changed completely. American forces entered the war with better communication equipment than the Japanese, but they still faced severe limitations. The U.S. Army and Marine Corps had excellent radio equipment at battalion and regimental level. The SCR-284 radio could communicate over 20 miles. But it weighed over 100 pounds and required a team of men to transport and operate it. At the company level, Americans had the SCR-536 handy-talkie, a walkie-talkie that an individual soldier could carry. But it had a range of only about 1 mile under ideal conditions, and often much less in jungle or mountainous terrain. Worse, it couldn't reach artillery fire direction centers in the rear. This created a critical gap. Company commanders at the front line could talk to their platoons with the SCR-536, but couldn't reach the artillery batteries that could provide fire support. The solution: field telephones and wire. American units would string thousands of yards of telephone wire forward to connect companies and observation posts to battalion headquarters. But wire had problems. It took time to string forward as units advanced. It was easily cut by enemy fire, vehicle traffic, or environmental factors. Once cut, it took time to find the break and repair it. It limited mobility. Units had to stay near their telephone positions. Wire crews were exposed to enemy fire while stringing and repairing lines. American officers recognized this was inadequate. In the fast-moving jungle warfare of the Pacific, units couldn't wait 30 minutes for fire support. They needed a way to call artillery almost immediately. The solution was already being developed. In 1940, well before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Army Signal Corps identified the need for a portable backpack radio that could bridge the gap between company-level combat and battalion-level command. The requirements seemed almost impossible. Light enough for one soldier to carry and operate. Powerful enough to transmit 5 to 10 miles. Durable enough to survive jungle humidity, rain, mud, and rough handling. Battery-powered with sufficient operating time. Frequency modulated to resist interference. Easy enough for infantry soldiers to operate under combat stress. The SCR-300, Signal Corps Radio number 300, that emerged was genuinely revolutionary for its time. Weight and portability. The complete set weighed about 35 pounds with batteries. This sounds heavy, but it was extraordinarily light for a radio with its capabilities. For comparison, the SCR-284 battalion radio weighed over 100 pounds and required multiple operators. The SCR-300 was designed as a backpack unit. One soldier, the radio operator, would carry the radio on his back, with the control unit mounted on his chest for easy access. This left his hands free to use weapons if necessary. Range: the SCR-300 could reliably communicate 3 to 5 miles in typical terrain, and up to 10 miles under ideal conditions or with elevated antennas. Critically, this range was sufficient to reach from frontline infantry positions back to artillery fire direction centers. Frequency modulation. The SCR-300 used FM frequency modulation rather than AM amplitude modulation. This was cutting-edge technology in 1940. FM provided several advantages. Better resistance to static and interference. More reliable in poor weather. Harder for enemy to jam or intercept. Clearer voice quality under combat conditions. Durability. The SCR-300 was built for war. Its components were housed in a weatherproof case. Could survive rain, mud, drops, and rough handling. Engineers tested it by throwing units off trucks and submerging them in water. Power supply. The radio operated on batteries, specifically the BA-70 battery pack. A fresh battery provided about 20 hours of operation in receive mode, or about 8 to 10 hours with moderate transmitting. Radio operators typically carried spare batteries. Ease of operation. This was crucial. The SCR-300 had to be operated by infantry soldiers under fire, not specialized signal corps technicians. The controls were simple: on-off switch, volume control, channel selector, 40 channels available, push-to-talk button on the handset. A soldier could be trained to operate the SCR-300 in a few hours. Under combat conditions, that simplicity was life-saving. Full production of the SCR-300 began in 1942. By 1943, the radios were reaching combat units in significant numbers. By the end of the war, over 50,000 SCR-300 units had been produced. Initially, each infantry company received 1 or 2 SCR-300 radios. By 1944, allocation had increased. Some companies had 3 or 4, with additional sets for forward observers and reconnaissance units. Marine Corps units in the Pacific were priority recipients. The Corps recognized that in jungle warfare, where units were often isolated and visibility was limited, radio communication was more important than almost any other equipment. The radio was typically operated by a specially trained radio operator, often called an RTO, radio telephone operator. This was a critical job. The RTO stayed close to the company commander at all times, ready to establish communication instantly. But the real revolution wasn't the radio itself. It was what American forces did with it. The artillery revolution. The SCR-300 transformed American artillery from a slow, deliberate weapon into something approaching real-time fire support. American forces developed a sophisticated forward observer system that took full advantage of the SCR-300's capabilities. Forward observers, FOs, were specially trained artillery officers or experienced NCOs assigned to accompany infantry units at the front line. Each FO carried or was accompanied by a radio operator with an SCR-300. The FO's job was to observe enemy positions and activity, calculate firing coordinates using maps, compass, and range-finding equipment, call fire missions directly to the Artillery Fire Direction Center via the SCR-300, observe where shells landed and radio immediate corrections, continue adjusting fire until targets were neutralized. This system eliminated multiple steps in the communication chain. The FO at the front line could speak directly to the Fire Direction Center miles in the rear. No runners, no relay stations, no delays. Meanwhile, American artillery units developed sophisticated fire direction centers that could quickly calculate firing solutions and coordinate multiple batteries. When a forward observer called for fire, here's what happened. Step 1, 10 seconds FO radios target location, description, and urgency to FDC. Step 2, 20 seconds FDC plots target on map, calculates range, bearing, and elevation. Step 3, 10 seconds FDC radios firing data to gun batteries. Step 4, 15 seconds gun crews adjust aim and load. Step 5, 5 seconds guns fire. Total time from request to shells in the air, 60 seconds or less. But it got even better. The FDC could coordinate multiple batteries to fire simultaneously. A forward observer could request fire from an entire artillery battalion, 12 105mm howitzers, and have all 12 shells arrive on target at the same moment. This time-on-target technique was devastating. Instead of a few shells arriving every few seconds as guns fired individually, targets would suddenly be hit by a dozen shells simultaneously. There was no warning, no time to take cover. Just instant, overwhelming destruction. Perhaps the most revolutionary aspect was real-time fire adjustment. Traditional artillery doctrine required firing a few ranging shots, observing where they landed, calculating corrections, and then firing for effect. This process could take multiple minutes. With the SCR-300, forward observers could provide corrections within seconds of shells landing. FO, Splash. Add 50 yards. Left 25. FDC. Add 50. Left 25. Confirmed. Shot out. 15 seconds later, corrected shells land. FO. On target. Fire for effect. This rapid adjustment meant American artillery could hit moving targets, respond to changing tactical situations, and provide danger-close fire support with precision that would have been impossible with slower communication systems. For American infantry, knowing they had artillery support available within 60 seconds was enormously reassuring. They could take risks, advance aggressively, and engage superior enemy forces because they knew devastating fire support was just a radio call away. One Marine Corps captain described it this way: "We weren't afraid of Japanese counterattacks anymore. We actually wanted them to attack us. Let them come out of their bunkers and try to charge our positions. Within a minute, we'd have every artillery battery in range dropping shells on their heads. It was like having the hand of God on our side." For Japanese troops, the experience was terrifying and demoralizing. Japanese soldiers and commanders struggled to understand what they were facing. In early Pacific battles, Japanese troops noticed American artillery seemed unusually responsive. But they attributed this to having more artillery pieces or more ammunition, both of which were true. It wasn't until mid-1943, particularly during the campaigns in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, that Japanese commanders began to realize something more fundamental was happening. After-action reports from surviving Japanese officers described the phenomenon. American artillery fire arrives with impossible speed. Our attacks are detected and targeted before we can close with enemy positions. Their artillery seems to follow our movements. We attempted a night flanking maneuver. Within minutes of beginning our approach, artillery fire began landing on our route. How did they know? There was no time for them to have scouted our position and relayed information. Japanese infantry tactics were built around speed and aggression. The typical Japanese assault doctrine was approach enemy positions covertly, mass infantry for sudden, overwhelming assault, close rapidly before enemy artillery can respond, engage in close combat where Japanese training gave them an advantage. This doctrine assumed artillery was a slow, reactive weapon that couldn't respond quickly enough to stop a determined infantry charge. The SCR-300 system broke this assumption. Japanese troops would mass for an attack, and before they could complete their assault, American artillery would be landing on their assembly areas. They would attempt flanking maneuvers, and fire would follow them. They would try to reinforce defensive positions under attack, and shells would hit the reinforcement routes. A Japanese regimental commander captured on Saipan in 1944 told his interrogators, "We could not understand how American artillery could respond so quickly. Our own artillery required many minutes to arrange fire support. Sometimes we would request artillery support and receive no response for an hour or more because telephone lines were damaged. But American artillery seemed to fire within moments of their infantry requesting it. It was as if their infantry and artillery were the same force." In late 1943, Japanese forces on Bougainville captured an American Marine position and recovered an SCR-300 radio, mostly intact. Japanese signals intelligence officers examined it with great interest. They recognized it as a technological achievement, portable, powerful, and sophisticated. But having the radio didn't help them. The problems were multiple. Manufacturing capability. Japan lacked the industrial capacity and miniaturized components to mass-produce similar radios. Japanese industry was struggling to produce enough basic infantry equipment. Sophisticated FM radios were beyond their manufacturing capabilities. Doctrinal integration. Even if Japan could produce similar radios, their artillery organization wasn't designed to take advantage of them. Japanese artillery doctrine was based on centralized control and pre-planned fires, not responsive forward observer systems. Systemic disadvantage. The SCR-300 was just one part of an integrated American fire support system that included forward observers, sophisticated fire direction centers, abundant ammunition, and reliable logistics. Japan couldn't replicate the entire system. A Japanese signals officer who examined the captured SCR-300 wrote in his report, "This radio represents a level of technical sophistication and industrial capacity that demonstrates the material disparity between our forces and the Americans. Even if we could produce such equipment, we lack the trained operators, the supporting infrastructure, and the artillery ammunition to employ it effectively." Japanese forces tried to adapt to American communication superiority, but with limited success. Increased use of telephone wire. Japanese units tried to maintain better wire communication with their artillery. But American counter-battery fire, air attacks, and the mobility of Pacific warfare made this difficult. More radio sets. Japan attempted to produce and field more radios. But production numbers remained far below American levels, and Japanese radios remained heavier, shorter ranged, and less reliable than American equipment. Night attacks. Japanese commanders increasingly relied on night attacks, hoping darkness would reduce American artillery effectiveness. This helped somewhat, but American forward observers with SCR-300s could still call fire on sound contacts, muzzle flashes, or illuminated areas. Dispersed attacks. Instead of mass charges, Japanese units tried more dispersed infiltration tactics. This reduced casualties from concentrated artillery but also reduced the shock and power of Japanese attacks. None of these adaptations really solved the problem. The communication gap was simply too large. Let's look at specific battles where the SCR-300 and American artillery communication made the difference between victory and defeat. Case Study 1. Bougainville, November 1943. The 3rd Marine Division landed on Bougainville in the Solomon Islands on November 1, 1943. Japanese defenders, believing they had time before the Marines could establish strong positions, planned a major counterattack for November 7th. Colonel Iwasa Shun, commanding Japanese forces in the sector, organized a coordinated assault using 3 battalions, nearly 2,000 men. The plan was to attack along multiple routes simultaneously, overwhelming American positions before artillery could respond effectively. What Colonel Iwasa didn't know was that every Marine Rifle Company had an SCR-300 radio and a forward observer from the 12th Marines Artillery Regiment. The Japanese attack began at 5:30 a.m. Within 2 minutes, Marine forward observers were calling fire missions. Within 4 minutes, 105mm shells from the 12th Marines batteries were landing on Japanese assembly areas. Marine Captain John Monks, commanding a forward rifle company, described the battle. "The Japanese came through the jungle in their typical style. Aggressive, noisy, lots of yelling. My artillery FO got on the radio immediately. I could hear him talking to the guns. Fire mission, infantry in the open, grid coordinates. 60 seconds later, shells were landing right on top of them. We adjusted fire, walking it into the jungle where they were forming up. Before they ever reached our wire, that attack was broken. The 3-battalion Japanese assault was shattered in less than 30 minutes. American artillery fired over 1,200 rounds in that brief period, called in by forward observers using SCR-300 radios. Japanese casualties exceeded 800 men. Marine casualties in the same action were 18 dead and 32 wounded, almost all from the initial Japanese approach before artillery fire became effective. Colonel Iwasa, who survived the battle, wrote in his journal, "The American artillery response was impossibly rapid. We had no time to close with their positions. Our casualties were devastating. I do not understand how they coordinate their fire so quickly." Case Study 2. Saipan, June 1944. The battle for Saipan provided another dramatic demonstration of American artillery communication superiority. On the night of July 7, 1944, Japanese forces on Saipan launched one of the largest banzai charges of the Pacific War. Nearly 4,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and civilian volunteers, led by Lieutenant General Saito Yoshitsugu, charged American positions held by the 27th Infantry Division. The attack began at 4 a.m. The initial Japanese surge overran several forward American positions through sheer mass and ferocity. But within 3 minutes of the attack beginning, American forward observers were radioing fire missions. Despite the chaos, darkness, and close quarters, artillery support began arriving. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien, commanding the 1st Battalion 105th Infantry, was in the center of the Japanese attack. His radio operator, Private First Class James Thompson, maintained contact with division artillery throughout the battle despite Japanese troops being within yards of their position. O'Brien later described it. Thompson stayed on that radio the whole time. He was calling in fire coordinates even as Japanese soldiers were trying to break into our command post. At one point, he was fighting with his rifle in one hand and keying the radio with the other, directing artillery fire to within 50 yards of our position. That radio saved us. American artillery fired more than 2,600 rounds during the 4-hour battle. The accurate, responsive fire broke the back of the Japanese charge before it could completely overrun American positions. By dawn, the battle was over. More than 3,000 Japanese attackers lay dead. American casualties were heavy, over 600 killed or wounded, but the position held. Without the rapid artillery response enabled by SCR-300 communications, the Japanese charge might have succeeded in breaking through American lines. Case Study 3, Leyte, Philippines, October 1944. The SCR-300 proved its worth not just in defense but also in American offensive operations. During the American invasion of Leyte in the Philippines, the 24th Infantry Division faced strong Japanese defenses in the hills around Breakneck Ridge. Japanese positions were well fortified, dug into reverse slopes where they were difficult to target. American infantry attacks repeatedly stalled against these positions. Traditional artillery bombardment was ineffective because observers couldn't see the Japanese positions to adjust fire. The solution: forward observers with SCR-300 radios advanced with the assault infantry, sometimes ahead of them. Lieutenant Robert Brumfield, an artillery forward observer, volunteered to accompany a reconnaissance patrol deep into Japanese-held territory. Carrying an SCR-300, Brumfield reached a position where he could observe Japanese fortifications from the flank. From this exposed position, Brumfield directed artillery fire onto Japanese positions for over 6 hours. His radio calls brought down fire from multiple batteries, destroying bunkers and fortifications that had held up the American advance for days. At one point, Japanese troops spotted Brumfield's position and counterattacked. Brumfield called artillery fire onto his own position, then moved to a new location before the shells arrived. The Japanese attack was devastated. Brumfield's after-action report was matter-of-fact. Radio communication allowed me to maintain continuous contact with Fire Direction Center despite being forward of our lines. I could request fire, observe results, and make immediate adjustments. This would have been impossible with any other communication method. For his actions, Brumfield received the Silver Star. But more importantly, his use of the SCR-300 became a model for aggressive forward observer tactics throughout the Pacific. Case Study 4, Okinawa, April 1945. By the time of the Okinawa Campaign in April 1945, American artillery infantry coordination via SCR-300 radio had become almost an art form. Japanese defenders on Okinawa, under Lieutenant General Ushijima Mitsuru, had prepared elaborate defensive positions. Japanese commanders knew about American artillery capabilities and tried to counter them by building positions on reverse slopes where forward observers couldn't see them, constructing deep fortifications that could survive artillery bombardment, limiting movement during daylight when observers were most effective. But American forces had developed new techniques. Forward observers would coordinate with infantry to conduct reconnaissance by fire, deliberately drawing Japanese fire to reveal positions, then immediately calling artillery strikes on those positions. Multiple forward observers with SCR-300s would coordinate to triangulate Japanese positions from different angles, even on reverse slopes. Artillery batteries developed techniques for walking fire, slowly adjusting shells across an area, while forward observers guided them onto targets they couldn't directly see. Marine Lieutenant Colonel James Donovan described the evolution. By Okinawa, we had perfected the system. Every rifle company had a forward observer with a radio. Every platoon leader knew how to call for fire if needed. We could have shells on target in less than a minute. The Japanese knew we had this capability, so they tried to hide from it. But we learned how to find them anyway and bring fire down on them. The radio made all of it possible. American artillery fired over 2.5 million rounds during the Okinawa campaign, an average of over 33,000 rounds per day for 82 days. This massive expenditure of firepower was made effective by the precise targeting enabled by SCR-300 communication. While artillery coordination was the most dramatic use of the SCR-300, the radio revolutionized battlefield communication in other ways. The SCR-300's range made it ideal for coordinating naval gunfire support during amphibious operations. Forward observers landing with assault waves could call fire from offshore warships. Battleships and cruisers, with their massive guns, could provide fire support equivalent to entire artillery battalions, but only if they could be accurately directed. The SCR-300 made this possible. Shore fire control parties with SCR-300s could communicate directly with fire control officers on ships miles offshore, bringing down 16-inch naval gunfire with precision. During the Iwo Jima invasion, Marine forward observers used SCR-300s to direct naval gunfire from over 30 ships. This fire support was critical in breaking Japanese resistance in the heavily fortified island. The SCR-300 also enabled better coordination with close air support. Forward air controllers with SCR-300s could communicate with circling aircraft, directing them onto targets that frontline troops were engaging. While the SCR-300 couldn't directly communicate with aircraft, different frequencies, forward air controllers could use the radios to maintain contact with air liaison officers at headquarters, who would then direct aircraft. This system dramatically reduced the time from target identification to airstrike, often less than 15 minutes in mature theaters like the Philippines campaign. Beyond fire support, the SCR-300 improved overall command and control. Battalion and regimental commanders could maintain contact with companies spread across miles of jungle or mountains. Units that became isolated or cut off could call for supplies, reinforcements, or evacuation. During the Bougainville campaign, a Marine company was cut off for 3 days. Their SCR-300 radio allowed them to coordinate their defense, request ammunition resupply by airdrop, and eventually guide friendly forces to their position for relief. Without the radio, the company would likely have been overwhelmed or forced to attempt a breakout with heavy casualties. The SCR-300 saved lives through improved medical evacuation coordination. Medical corpsmen or officers with isolated units could radio for medical evacuation, providing precise coordinates and casualty information. This allowed medics to prepare appropriate supplies and evacuation means, whether foot stretcher parties, jeep ambulances, or amphibious vehicles. In jungle terrain where wounded soldiers might otherwise take hours or days to evacuate, the SCR-300 enabled much faster response, improving survival rates significantly. Forward reconnaissance patrols equipped with SCR-300s could report enemy movements in real time. Instead of patrolling for hours or days before returning to report, scouts could radio immediate updates. This allowed commanders to respond to intelligence while it was still actionable. During the Philippines campaign, Army reconnaissance teams with SCR-300s would infiltrate behind Japanese lines and radio reports of enemy troop movements, supply columns, and defensive preparations. This intelligence was immediately valuable and sometimes led to airstrikes or artillery fire within minutes of observation. The SCR-300 and the communication revolution it enabled had impacts far beyond individual battles. The communication advantage gave American forces a multiplier effect that partially offset Japanese advantages in terrain knowledge, defensive preparation, and individual soldier fighting skill. In terrain like the Pacific jungles or mountain ranges, where visibility was limited and movement was difficult, Japanese forces had expected to fight on relatively equal terms. Superior communication changed that equation. American forces could coordinate actions across broader fronts, concentrate forces more quickly, and provide fire support more effectively. This meant American units could operate more aggressively with smaller numbers, knowing they had responsive support. While multiple factors influenced casualty ratios, the improvement in artillery effectiveness through better communication was significant. In Pacific battles from 1943 onward, American casualties from Japanese infantry attacks decreased substantially even as the Japanese continued to launch aggressive assaults. Artillery fire, accurately directed by forward observers with SCR-300s, was breaking up attacks before they could reach American lines. Conversely, American infantry could advance with greater confidence, knowing artillery support was immediately available if they encountered strong resistance. By late 1944, captured Japanese documents and prisoner interrogations revealed that Japanese commanders had identified American artillery communication superiority as a critical factor in their defeats. A Japanese divisional staff officer captured on Luzon in 1945 told interrogators, "We recognized that American artillery was not only more numerous but could respond far more quickly than our own. Their forward observers seemed to have immediate communication with their guns. This made our traditional infantry assault tactics almost suicidal. But we had no effective counter to their system." The SCR-300 influenced post-war military communication development worldwide. The Korean War saw extensive use of improved versions of the SCR-300. The Vietnam War's PRC-25 Prick-25 radio was a direct descendant. Modern infantry radios like the PRC-117 and PRC-152 are evolutionary developments of the same concept, giving individual soldiers and small units the ability to communicate over tactical distances. The fundamental principle established by the SCR-300, that infantry and supporting arms must have immediate, reliable communication, became doctrine for every modern military. While the SCR-300 didn't receive public fanfare like fighter planes or tanks, military professionals recognized its importance. General Douglas MacArthur, in a 1944 report, identified improved communication equipment including the SCR-300 as one of the key factors in American success in the Pacific. General Holland Howling Mad Smith, Marine Corps commander in the Pacific, stated, "If I had to choose between giving up a battalion of infantry or giving up our SCR-300 radios, I'd give up the infantry. The radios make every unit we have more effective." In the end, the SCR-300 represented something profound about the American way of war. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized individual courage, aggressive spirit, and willingness to die in close combat, American doctrine emphasized technology, coordination, and bringing overwhelming firepower to bear. The SCR-300 embodied this philosophy. It was a technological solution that gave American soldiers a critical advantage without requiring them to be individually superior fighters. It was a tool that multiplied effectiveness through better coordination rather than through greater numbers alone. For Japanese soldiers charging American positions in the jungles of the Pacific, the experience must have been terrifying and demoralizing. They were brave, well-trained, and committed. But within a minute of beginning their attack, shells would begin falling on them with uncanny accuracy. The Americans they faced seemed to have an invisible advantage, the ability to call down fire from the sky almost instantly. That advantage wasn't magic. It was a 35-pound radio carried on a Marine's back, operated by a trained forward observer, connected to a sophisticated fire direction center coordinating multiple artillery batteries. It was American industrial capability producing 50,000 radios. It was American military doctrine integrating technology into tactics. It was American training teaching thousands of soldiers to operate complex equipment under combat stress. And it was devastatingly effective. The Japanese troops who faced American forces in the Pacific never expected walkie-talkies to coordinate artillery in 60 seconds. By the time they learned this lesson, it was too late. The communication revolution had changed warfare itself. If you enjoyed this deep dive into WW2 military technology and tactics, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Check out our other videos exploring the weapons, innovations, and battles that shaped World War II. Thanks for watching.